You tell me.
We're so glad you're here with us this evening. My name is Tom Dyson. I'm usually sitting out in front here during Recharge, but I get the joy of being up here with Jonathan Pugh this evening instead of sitting out front, and I want to enjoy with you listening to what he has to say today. He's one of our pastors here at Venture. He's actually our pastor over our life groups here. And Jonathan, what are we going to talk about tonight?
We're continuing on in Genesis, so we've gone to the Torah, and Randall and Austin got really involved in why is Genesis at the front of the Bible, what's its role in the Torah last week. So they were supposed to cover Genesis 1 through 11 last week. They ended up covering, I think, 1 through 3, and then mentioned some stuff about the flood. So we're going to pick up in chapter 11 this week and go through chapter 24 of Genesis. And you say, well, there's 50 chapters in Genesis. Why is that? We're only going to get through 24. Well, you're going to get to hear from Tom for the next 2 weeks to finish out the book. So let's talk just a minute, just from your perspective, Tom. Why is Genesis important? Why are we opening this up and going so slowly through Genesis?
Well, Genesis lays such a foundation for even the context of everything else in the Bible, everything of the Old Covenant, the New Covenant. It all fits within this package of where this all came from. It's anchored in the universe that exists, how it came to be. And then the family that was the chosen people of God, the Israelites. We see that whole story of how that came to be. So I just think it's so foundational that the rest of the story is not just floating out there.
So we're going to focus in particular tonight on one man, and that man's name is Abram. He has his name changed as we go through the story to Abraham. And the reason he's important is because might be, there's three, I would say really three critical figures in the covenant life of the Old Testament. The first one of those is Abraham. The second one, well, you could say for Adam. There's a covenant with Adam, a covenant with Noah. Then there's a covenant with Abraham, Moses, and David. And these are really the big figures in Old Testament salvation history, I would say. But Abraham is really a central figure because it's through Abram that we start to learn what this idea of living and being justified by faith is. And of course, all that comes in the New Testament. There's a whole book, the book of Hebrews. Before you came, Tom, Austin took us through a series where we actually preached through the Abraham narrative in Genesis, but we actually started in verse 1, then skipped over to the book of Hebrews and preached through the book of Hebrews. Took the better part of a year to do it, but it really did a great job for our church of connecting those two. Yeah. And all of that's online, so I encourage you, if what we say tonight, I have a very short time to tell you who Abram is, but we took probably 3 months to explain who Abram is in the life of Venture Church. So go back. That'll be, I believe, in 2016. I'm pretty sure that was in 2016 that we did that. So those are all in our sermon archives that are available online. But I want to get started. I promised you we'd be in Genesis 11. We talked about the Tower of Babel. So following the flood, we start to have these nations. Genesis 10 is a table of nations. I could do a whole show just on the table of nations. We could pull out a map and we could talk about who are these people. We could talk about why is Putin doing the things he's doing, and you can even go to the table of nations and find some traces in there. But then you get to Genesis 11, and God. The nations had built this great tower. There was pride in basically building a society all in one. And so God came and leveled civilization in essence, not in the sense of he destroyed people, but he made their languages unintelligible and scattered, because God's plan from the beginning was subdue the earth. That means scatter throughout the earth. His intention was never for mankind to stay in one place, but it was for mankind to rule and subdue the earth. And so God accomplished that through the spreading of the nations in the Tower of Babel. And so the next time you have trouble communicating with somebody, or you can't understand some southern accent or something, thank God and the Tower of Babel for that. But in particular, following the Tower of Babel, we have another table of descendants that these people are in Genesis chapter 10, but they're repeated in Genesis 11. And these are in particular the descendants of Shem. And so we have, I believe, 10, 11 generations listed from Shem, who's one of the three sons of Noah, to a man named Terah, who becomes significant because of who he fathers, and that's this man named Abram. But what did you determine that all of these people basically, we can't comprehend this in today's age. If we're lucky, we get to know our great-grandparents. Sure. In today's age, right. So 4 generations, and that's considered the normal span of life. How many generations did Abram get to know of his ancestors? Well, from what
I understand, Shem, he had his first child at 100 years old, and he lived another 500 years. Well, his offspring were having children at 30 years, and it really shortened up at that point, to where if you calculate it out, it turns out that Shem lived approximately 39 years into the life of Abraham, and most likely in a fairly close proximity to where he was. Mm-hmm. So, you think of Noah's flood as just way, Abraham's way back. Noah's flood is just off the map up back there. Mm-hmm. They were contemporaries.
Wow.
It's just amazing to me.
That blew my mind.
Yeah, the story of Noah was at least carried that far by an eyewitness.
So when we're hearing these things, you say, well, how did Abram know about God? That's always a question we ask when we come to, say, Genesis chapter 12. Mm-hmm. We find out Terah was, so Abram's hometown was in the city of Ur. Archaeologists are pretty convinced today that the city of Ur was in what's today southern Iraq. If you know Iraq, the Al-Basra region, and it's been excavated. We pretty much know where it's at, and that's where Abraham was born. Well, Ur was founded by one of Shem's sons, we believe, if not one of his grandsons. Mm-hmm. So think of 10 generations of the Shem family living right there in Ur. Now, of course, others of them, they spread out throughout the Middle East. This is why we call Jewish people and Muslim people, they're Semites, because they're from the line of Shem. But that just boggles my mind that they got away, at least when you come to Terah in the family line, Abraham's father. He was not a worshiper of Yahweh. But I just can't help but think that they knew something about God from, how could Shem tell the story of this flood without mentioning God?
Absolutely.
Shem helped build the ark.
He lived through that experience of obeying God and following him through all that, and then having the waters come and being rescued through the waters. He lived it, and yet he was alive all the way through till Abraham. Surely.
I can't wait to get to heaven and hear these stories. So that's not even the focus of what we're going to talk about tonight, but that just blew my mind. But we're going to pick up in Genesis chapter 12, and you have some interesting things, some interesting dialogue going on. So for whatever reasoning, we're not told why. Beginning in verse 31 of Genesis chapter 11, it says this: Terah took Abram his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, and his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to enter the land of Canaan. And they went as far as Haran and settled there. We have no idea why did Terah. Now, if I wish we had a map here. Iraq to Canaan to Israel is a long journey, and we tend to think of it as across the desert. That's not how they would have traveled in those days. They would have followed essentially the Euphrates River, the fertile. You learn about the country of Iraq, Mesopotamia. Is what's referred to as the Fertile Crescent. You have to follow rivers because you have to have food, water, all these things to sustain life. You can't just take out across the desert. So they would have followed the Euphrates River, in essence, up until what's today eastern Syria, northern Iraq, southeastern Turkey, and rather than continuing on to Israel, they settled there. And so when we talk about what's home for Abram in these stories, it's not Ur, it's Haran. It's that area of northern Iraq, eastern Syria, southeastern Turkey. And that's where the story picks up in Genesis 12. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country being Haran and the northern part of the Fertile Crescent. Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." So from the outset, God tells Abram, this is what I'm going to do. And he just straight up makes promises. Now we're going to talk in chapter 15 about there's a covenant that's made later. Right now it's just promises, and nothing Abram's done. We don't even have an indication that Abram's made any commitment to God at this point. In fact, most people believe that he has not, because that comes later. But it's really important that we see from the outset, what is it that God is promising to do in Abram? So and you can jump in here at any point, what do you think are the important things that God's doing in the life of Abram, Tom?
Well, that's the beginning, of course, of the nation. Turns out to be Israel.
He's going to turn him into a nation.
That's right.
Yep.
And blessing the world through him. Of course, then I'm not sure exactly where you're going, but if we follow this on through, we route on out to the Lord Jesus Christ.
The Lord Jesus Christ.
Yes, who came through this line. I mean, there it is.
Yeah, so he's promising a nation. He's promising a great name. But more importantly, he promises that you will be a blessing.
Oh, yes.
You will be a blessing. And that's exactly what the blessing is. From you, all the nations of the world will be blessed. You'll be a nation, but your nation will bless the nations.
And Christ, the descendant, will bless all the nations.
Yes.
Yes.
So we see even from there's that promise of the Messiah. Last week they talked about Genesis 3:15, the promise of the Messiah. Bring that all the way through. The rainbow is a promise of a Messiah, or the ark itself is a promise of a Messiah. Then you come here, in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. An interesting thing. So Abram went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So Abram's never been where he's going. He doesn't know really why he's going, other than God's promised to make me a nation. He doesn't know how that's going to happen. Doesn't have children at this point, but God has spoken to him, and Abram picks up at 75 years old, which I think is a lesson unto itself. We talk about challenges for most people think their life is over at 75 years old. Abram's was beginning at 75 years old. Most people think Moses' life was beginning at 80 years old. We often forget about that.
Those lifespans, though, were so wide at that point. 75 might not have felt like it does now. Don't know.
75 is a lot of years, though.
Yeah, it is.
It is. So we get through. But almost from the beginning, chapter 10 already, it sounds like, man, this is going to be a great journey. We're going to see great things happen. It's almost like a road trip. But disaster strikes in 12:10. So almost right out of the gate, do we see something happen? So Abram gets to Bethel. He gets to the promised land, pitches his tent. But now in verse 10, there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there. Now, anytime in the Old Testament when people go to Egypt, something's wrong. There's something about to happen, and that's no different in the case of Abram. It came about when he came near to Egypt that he said to Sarai his wife, "See now, I know that you're a beautiful woman, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife,' and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say that you're my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that I may live on account of you." It came about when Abram came into Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. Pharaoh's officials saw her, praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. Therefore he treated Abram well for her sake, and gave him sheep and oxen and donkeys and male and female servants and female donkeys and camels. But the Lord struck Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Then Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, that I took her for my wife? Now then, here's your wife, take her and go." And Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they escorted him away with his wife and all that belonged to him. So right from the gate, out of the gate, we see a deep character flaw within Abram, and it gets repeated. Later on, we'll talk about it. But even though he's gone on this journey by faith, here's God, God says go, he goes. When things get difficult, he loses faith easily. Mm-hmm. And why do you say that? Well, first of all, just the morality of it. You know, I'm going to give my wife to another man and say she's my sister just so I can save my hide. Now, right. It was a legitimate fear in those days. So the ancient world, they probably had a greater concern against adultery than we do today. So even Pharaoh would not likely commit adultery. Mm-hmm. What he would do instead is, if he wanted somebody's wife, he'd just kill him. And so that's the way kings worked in those days. So Abram has this legitimate fear, but rather than trusting that God will protect him, Abram places his trust in himself, or even if I'm not Sarai's husband, but instead I'm her brother, which he actually was, then it can go well with me and I can benefit from this rather than fear for my life.
Sure.
But even in all of this, you see that the Lord, he has a special provision on Abram. Even in Abram's weakness, he brings, and this is a foreshadow of what's going to happen in Exodus, he brings plagues on Pharaoh and his household because he's wronged Abram. He's taken his wife, even if it was unknowing. And he starts giving Abram all this stuff. He sends Abram away with all this stuff that Pharaoh's given him. And
big payoff for what he did.
It's a foreshadow of Exodus.
Yes.
So it's pretty amazing that what happens to all of the Hebrew people later on has mm-hmm. already happened to their forefather, Abram. Mm-hmm. Get to chapter 13. Chapter 13, we're really introduced to, we've already heard Lot's name mentioned. You might be thinking, if you don't know the rest of the story, you would think, well, Lot, being the nephew, is likely who would be the inheritor of the promise of Abram. And, you know, Abram doesn't have children. His wife's barren. So surely Lot will be the next of kin who's going to inherit the herds and all this stuff that Pharaoh has given to him. But we start to see, we get a picture of who Lot is beginning in 13 when we see Lot and Abram's herdsmen are fighting with each other over water. You know, so they likely both had big flocks. They needed the scarce resources out in the desert. Their herdsmen are fighting with who's going to get to water the herds. And so Abram and Lot, rather than coming together and say, all right, we got to work together, apparently they're just not able to do that. So they say, well, we're going to divide up. Abram is the magnanimous one in this relationship. He says, all right, Lot, you choose where you want to go, and I'll go the opposite way. And that way we can both settle and wander and do what we need to do. Lot chose the good land. Abram chose, and so Abram went the opposite direction. But what we come to find out about Lot is rather than continue as a sojourner, as a Hebrew, as a wanderer, keeping flocks, Lot actually goes and pitches his tents near the cities. And these are cities that are going to have significance later on in Genesis, the city of Sodom in particular. And Lot becomes more or less a citizen of the country in a way that Abram never was. Abram always kept his distinctiveness from the nations of Canaan. Lot became one of them, but he never became fully one of them. Right. We're going to find that out later. Chapter 14, this is an interesting chapter because of the salvation history, because of this man named Melchizedek. And if you go back and listen to the sermons in Hebrews, you'll find out a lot more about Melchizedek and his significance. But there's these kings that come from the north and the east, and they go on a raid, and they take away the subjects, the wives, the children, the slaves, the flocks of this what would we call it, a confederation of kings of which Sodom and Gomorrah are a part. They're taken away, including Lot. So Lot, being the nearest kin of Abram gets involved, and Abram has these men under his command. He goes, chases these guys down. It's actually a really incredible feat when you really map out what he did. Defeats this confederation of kings, brings all the stuff back to the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and all these other cities, and he's allowed to keep what's his and part of the spoils. But he's met along the way by this character Melchizedek. We know nothing about him other than it says he's the king of Salem. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a Jew. I found this out researching for tonight. There's a Jewish, and I don't know that there's really anything to it, but it's a Jewish teaching in some parts of Judaism that Melchizedek is actually Shem himself.
Oh, wow.
I don't know. I don't know how they get that, especially considering he would have died 40 plus years before this. Mm-hmm. But that's a common belief within Judaism. I don't buy it, but it's just an interesting thought. But Melchizedek is an important character because Abram actually he blesses Abram, and Abram responds to this blessing by giving Melchizedek 1/10 of all the spoils. So there's some sort of a subordination that Abram makes to this King Melchizedek, some sort of a response of I guess you would call it subordination, and that's the way Hebrews talks about it. And essentially, Melchizedek is a type of Jesus Christ later on in regards to the relationship of the Jewish people to the covenant, the new covenant that Jesus makes later on. I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about that as we go along in the Old Testament, but just keep that in the back of your mind, this mysterious character Melchizedek, because he has an important role in salvation history. The big chapter between 12 and 24, in my mind, for salvation history is Genesis chapter 15. And this is the one place I want to read. In fact, I'll ask you, are you able to read a little bit, Tom?
I think so. With this light in my eye,
if you don't mind, just read through chapter 15 down to verse 18.
You know what? In this light, I think I can see yours better.
Yep. I'll give you mine. Read chapter
verse 18.
15, 1 through 18 for us.
After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, "Do not fear, Abram. I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great." Abram said, "O Lord God, what will you give me, since I am childless, and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus?" And Abram said, "Since you have given no offspring to me, one born in my house is my heir." I think I read that wrong. And Abram said, "Since you have given no offspring to me, one born in my house is my heir." Then behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "This man will not be your heir, but one who will come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir." And he took him outside and said, "Now look toward the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them." And he said to him, "So shall your descendants be." Then he believed in the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. And he said to him, "I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess it." He said, "O Lord God, how may I know that I will possess it?" So he said to him, "Bring me a 3-year-old heifer and a 3-year-old female goat and a 3-year-old ram and a turtle dove and a young pigeon." Then he brought all these to him and cut them in two, and laid each half opposite the other. But he did not cut the birds. The birds of prey came down upon the carcasses, and Adam drove them away. Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. God said to Abram, Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterwards they will come out with many possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, and will be buried at a good old age. Then in the 4th generation they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. It came about when the sun had set that it was very dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch which passed between these pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenite and the Kenizzite and the Cadmonite and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Rephaim and the Amorite and the Canaanite and the Girgashite and the Jebusite.
So what's going on here is, this is where, as we study this passage, we would say that Abraham actually begins a relationship with Yahweh. So he enters into a covenant with Yahweh. And that's the key here, is that word covenant. So what is a covenant? A covenant is an agreement between two parties. And this is a blood covenant. So they're saying the only thing that can break this covenant is death. And furthermore, they're saying if one of the two parties fails to abide by this covenant, death is the consequence. Now that's significant because Abram doesn't take the blood oath of the covenant. Only God does. When the animals are sacrificed and split apart, the way covenants would work is the two parties to the covenant would walk between the bodies of the animals and the birds, and they would say, we're going to be like, if we break this covenant, we'll be like these animals. Well, God caused a deep sleep to fall on Abram, so he never passed through the bodies of the animals. Only God himself did. So what's God saying? I'm going to keep this covenant, whether Abram fails or not. I'm keeping the covenant. It's on me. Abram, all these things that I've promised you, it will come to pass. Not because you earned it, not because you're really great at keeping the covenant, but because this is what I'm going to do. And I swear by my own life that I will do it. And that's what God does. But what is he promising Abram? Well, he's given him a very specific promise that, not only is Abram going to be made into a generalized great nation with land and all this, but he actually tells him what the land's going to be. It's the land where you're at now. Only he's saying, I'm giving it to these Amorites. They're going to have it for a few more generations, all these peoples, but they will be destroyed. They will be conquered. But more importantly, you're going to have a son, Abram. You're going to have a son of the promise who's going to be your heir. So this land that I'm giving you, it's not going to go to near relatives. It's going to go to descendants from you, which is really interesting because Abram at this point is an old man, and he doesn't have any children. He's just banking on the fact that it's going to go to his servant. So that's very significant. You have a nation, a land, and a blessing for all the people that's being promised to Abram. And it's being promised not because of Abram's goodness, but because God said it's going to happen, and I'm promising it. The key verse there being, and Abram believed God, and it was counted him as righteousness. That becomes the key phrase in the New Testament, that it's not through action that we gain God's favor, it's through faith. And that faith is what's considered righteousness, not the things that we actually accomplish as righteousness. All right, we could go on there. I got to move on. Yes. We got like 9 more chapters to do. We'll try to get through some of these more quickly. 16, you come to the next big failure of Abram, and that's this. And it's a joint failure between Abram and Sarai, his wife. So essentially, Abram's very old. We've already established that. They are assuming, however, it's Sarai who is the reason why they've not had a kid. So Sarai comes up with a plan. She says, I'm old, I'm not getting any younger, but I've got this female servant, Hagar. Why don't you have sex with her, produce a child through her, And maybe that's what God was promising. Well, that's not what God had promised. But Abram said, sounds good to me.
Yeah.
This is the next best thing. I'm going to take it into my own hands. And this is what we're going to do. He does, in fact, have a child. But this child is named whom, Tom?
Ishmael.
Ishmael. Ishmael is a descendant of Abram, but he's not the promised descendant of Abram. We're going to find out a little bit more later on. But in fact, Hagar, in this instance, there becomes an enmity between her and Sarai, and that enmity continues on later. But actually, an angel rescues Hagar and Ishmael, tells them to go back, and basically makes promises to Ishmael, but that are not the covenant promises of the Messiah, but they're promises that God's hand will be a hand of blessing on Ishmael, but Ishmael will also be a warrior who produces a warrior people. And these are the Arabs of today. They trace their lineage to Ishmael. Every good Arab will tell you that.
Sure. His people were going to be troubling to their neighbors.
Yep. And it all goes back to Genesis 16.
Yes.
And it ultimately goes back to Abram's lack of faith, causes trouble not just for himself, but for all of his descendants, both his descendants through Ishmael and his descendants through Isaac. In
fact, it's generally thought that Ishmael, they consider that that Muhammad was a descendant of Ishmael.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's made clear, I think, in the Quran. And in fact, you'll find a lot of these stories about Abraham in the Quran, but they will be with Ishmael as the promised child, not with Isaac. So that's the dividing line between Islam and Judaism, Christianity.
Yes, it is.
Judaism, Christianity sees Isaac as the promised child. Islam sees Ishmael as the promised child, and they'll go to war over it even today, which is crazy in our Western way of thinking. Genesis 17. This is where God comes back again and visits with Abram. And he actually changes Abram's name to Abraham. The name Abram meant exalted father. Abraham means father of many. And so it says, now when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless. I will establish my covenant. He reestablishes it here between me and you. And I'll multiply you exceedingly. Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, as for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you'll be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but you shall be called Abraham. For I've made you the father of a multitude of nations. And he goes on to explain, with Sarah listening in earshot, she's not part of the conversation, but she can hear it going on. He goes on to explain that, hey, you're 99, Sarai is 89, but she's going to have a son. About this time next year, she's going to have a son when I visit you again. The promise is going to come through that son. And a sign, and one significant thing that goes on in chapter 17 is that the sign of this covenant is that all the males born in your house, so you, your other son Ishmael, all of your servants, you're all going to be circumcised. If you're a kid, ask your parents what circumcision is. But for all time after that, that was the sign of a covenant relationship between the Abrahamic people and be it Muslims or Hebrews. The Abrahamic people had this sign of a covenant. I think that's right about Muslims. I'll have to fact check that. But for Jews, for sure, this is the sign of Jewishness, circumcision, and this is why we do this. So there's the explanation there, and all the way back to Genesis 17. That will come to prominence later on as we go through the Torah. Chapter 18, more of the same. The birth of Isaac is promised. But what goes on more here is Abraham has a request that he makes of God. So God tells him, not only are you going to have this son Isaac, but I'm also going to be, I've visited the valley where Sodom and Gomorrah are. I don't like what I've seen. I'm going to destroy it. Now Abraham, this catches his attention because he knows that that's where his nephew Lot lives. And so he starts to bargain with God. He says, if you can find 50 righteous men there, will you not save Sodom and Gomorrah for 50 righteous men? And God says, I'll do it for you. And he bargains on down, and Abraham says, well, there might not be 50 righteous men. Maybe if there's 40, maybe if there's 30, 10. I think he gets it down to 5 righteous men. God says, Abram, for you, if I can find 5 righteous men in Sodom, I'll spare the city. Well, obviously, he can't do it.
Right.
Because what happens in chapter 19, God he visits Sodom and Gomorrah. I guess in the form of, they see the form of angels going into the houses of Lot. And how did the men of Sodom and Gomorrah respond? Well, they want to have sexual relations with them. And they demand this. Lot, and you have to get into the mindset of that culture where you would even, we don't understand this as Westerners. I don't even think the worst of us would do this as Westerners, offer up your daughters instead of a man. But in the Middle Eastern context, even today, hospitality is the greatest virtue. When somebody comes under your roof, you've made a solemn vow that you'll do anything it takes to protect them. And that's really what Lot was doing. I don't think he didn't actually have to give up his daughters in this case, but it was the angels who blinded the eyes. I mean, they protected Lot. They told Lot and his daughters, and his wife, you got to get out of here. You got to run. We're destroying the city. And that's what happens. And it's a story of, even today, of God's judgment on sin. Now, there's some debate as to, people debate, well, what was the sin of Sodom? And I think you can safely say the sin of Sodom was all of the above.
Yeah.
All of the above. It was not one sin that got them, but it was many things that our culture says, oh, that's just fine. God's cool with that. No, he destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah over that. He still has an opinion on sin just like he did then. We need to tread lightly on that.
Sure. By the way, through the miracle of on-the-spot research, I find that circumcision is a part of the Muslim faith as well.
Oh, thank you, Tom.
Yeah, absolutely.
I appreciate that. All right, Genesis 20. You remember that story in Egypt where Abram says, Sarah's not my wife, she's my sister.
Yes.
It happens again in chapter 20. Only it's worse this time. And here's why it's worse in chapter 20. It's worse in chapter 20 because God has specifically told Abram something. He has specifically told him now, you're going to have a son. His name's going to be Isaac. And he's going to be Sarah's son. Mm-hmm. And so you would think that with that information, Abraham would do everything he could to protect his wife.
Right.
But he doesn't. He enters into a treaty with a king named Abimelech, and he does the same thing. He does the exact same thing where he says, Sarah's my sister, not my wife. Abimelech wants to take her as a wife. Mm-hmm. In this case, he doesn't actually take her because God actually intervenes in Abimelech, and God tells Abimelech, you need to give that man his wife back. And that's what Abimelech does. Abimelech is actually angry with Abram. He says, why wouldn't you just be honest with me? Mm-hmm. Why couldn't you be a righteous? Clearly Abram is being immoral. He's being unrighteous in what he's doing here. It's a pagan, Abimelech, who calls out Abraham's unrighteousness. But the real hero of the story is God, because it was God who spoke to Abimelech. It was God who caused him to give Sarah back. And what was God doing? He was protecting Sarah so that she would conceive a son for Abraham and not Abimelech. It's God who brought about the line of Isaac,
Yes.
not anything Abraham did on his own. And so
It's going to be interesting to see as we go into next week. This must be a hereditary thing because it continues in the family, but we'll get into that next week.
Yeah. We can talk about family. You get to talk about family dynamics next week. I used to be a youth pastor, and I love teaching the stories of the patriarchs to students. Because it's kind of wild stuff. You know, it can get their attention. But the other thing I tell them is, no matter how messed up you think your family is, they're probably not as messed up as Abraham's family. And God saved the world through Abraham's family.
Oh, yes.
So
there's hope. Line of Jesus.
This is the line of Jesus.
Yes.
So, there you go. Chapter 21, Isaac is born. But we see at this point, Ishmael is 14 years older than Isaac. So there's some sibling rivalry even there that continues to this day. Sarah, being protective mom, she actually sends Isaac or Ishmael and Hagar away this time. This is where Ishmael basically begins his own life as a wanderer. He's saved again. And also we see that there's a covenant made with this king Abimelech, who has accused Abraham of being, deceitful to him. But Abimelech says, hey, God's on his side. I better make a treaty with him. And that's what he does. Lands us now to chapter 22. Now, chapter 22, we're going to sit here for just a few minutes, not for too long. And this is a section of Scripture called the Akedah. And most of us you'll see it. It's also in the Quran, but Ishmael is the son in the Quran who's being offered as a sacrifice. Yes. We know that it's Isaac. But this takes place on a mountain that's later identified as the Temple Mount. This is so where you see the temple built, we talked about in Chronicles a couple weeks ago. The temple was built on this mount in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was not a city yet, but there was a mount. There was a mountain there, and that's the mount where Isaac was going to be sacrificed, because God told Abraham, "Take your son, your only son, take him up on the mountain, and you're going to offer a sacrifice." Now, Abraham probably knew what was going to happen, but this is where it comes full circle in the life of Abraham, where time after time after time his faith has failed. Now he's being asked, you've got to be willing to give up the one promise that makes all the other promises make sense, your son Isaac. You've got to be willing to give that up to God. And Abraham says, all right, I trust God. I trust God. And you can just feel him. If you read the story, you can just hear him every step of that journey as he takes his son and he takes the mule and he takes the wood for a sacrifice. You can just hear him saying in his mind, I trust God, I trust God, I trust God. Even up to the point where he's going to raise the dagger and kill Isaac, God stops him, and there's a ram that's going to be the sacrifice instead, which is a picture of Christ.
And there's nothing to make us think he was just kind of half doing that. Come on, God, when are you going to do it? I mean, God saw him come to that point and stopped him. I mean, the faith was complete there, it seems.
And Abram, I think we say, well, would he be mitigating? Would he be going against the promise that God had made him? No, I think that Abram, in his mind, he didn't know how God would remedy this situation, but I think he may have thought, well, he can raise Isaac from the dead. He could give us another child through Sarah. But Abram at this point has finally gotten through his head at probably 110 years old. I can trust God. Yep. If God tells me to do something, I can do it and I can trust it. But it only took him 110 years. Right.
But the same one that was promising...
Cut ourselves some slack here.
The same one promising this child was the one telling him what to do.
Yes.
So, same faith.
Yes. God reiterates his covenant again in chapter 22. By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Now, Remember, he has sent Ishmael away at this point. So he does have a son, Ishmael. It's been made clear, Ishmael is not the promise.
Yes.
Isaac's the promise. Because you've done this thing, you've not withheld anything from me. Indeed, I will greatly bless you. I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. And your seed, all the nations of the world shall be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba. So that's in the southern part of what today is Israel. And Abraham lived at Beersheba. Chapter 23 is significant because Sarah dies. But it's significant in salvation history because this is where we finally see a down payment for that promise that Abram, you'll possess land. So Sarah dies, and so you didn't just, you had to have a burial place. That was improper to not have a burial place, and that's where you're going to be, because part of the promise was if God blesses you, you live a long life, you get to go rest with your ancestors and be buried with them. Well, that means you have to have a place that's going to be in the family for generation to generation to generation.
Right.
Abraham doesn't have that. He's left his home. He doesn't own any land, ever. He's a nomad. He's a herder, a sheep herder. He's only living on land by permission, by doing trades and deals with all these other people. But when Sarah dies, he goes to one of the kings, to the sons of Heth, and he says, I need a place to bury my wife. And Abram, one thing we find out about him is he's well thought of. Everywhere he goes, he's well thought of by all of these pagan kings. And so they actually sell him the land with a cave. It's a field with a cave. That's all it is. That's the only land Abram ever owns, and it's to bury Sarah in. This becomes significant because you can actually still visit that cave, I'm told, in Israel today. It's actually in a part of Israel, I think it's in the West Bank. It's in a part of Israel that's controlled by the Muslims, but they have like so many days a year that Jews can go and visit this cave. And the rest of the time it's Muslims visiting this cave because they honor Abraham just as the Jews do. So one day I hope I get to visit the cave. That's in no way, why that's significant is you would think if God's promising this nation, descendants that you can't even count, and he actually tells them the land that he gets is going to be from the Mediterranean to the Euphrates, from the borders of Egypt all the way to the borders of what's today Iraq. God says that's going to be your land. But at the end of his life, he just has a field and a cave. That's all he owns. Mm-hmm. But by faith, he knows that it's coming.
It's a start.
It's a start. And so it's a down payment on what's to come. And you know that Abram believes this because we're going to end up right here in chapter 24. When it comes time for Isaac to get married, Abraham's late in life, and you got to find a bride for Isaac. I kind of get the sense that Isaac's, you might have a different take next week, we'll get into Isaac. I get the sense that Isaac's a little bit of a mama's boy. He's like 40 years old. He's not married yet.
Right.
He's, he can't, and maybe that's for good reason because Abram doesn't want him to marry a woman who doesn't believe in Yahweh. So he actually sends his servant back to Haran, and he makes him swear an oath. He says, promise me, I don't know how long I'm going to live. Promise me, you're not going to let Isaac marry one of the women of this land, but we have to continue the family line because I believe that what God has said is true. And so he goes back to the land of Haran. He actually finds, I believe, Laban, I believe, is a brother.
His mother's brother.
Mother's brother. Mm-hmm. His mother's brother.
One of his daughters.
You'll see the story. But it's Rebekah who comes out to serve the servant of Abram. Doesn't know who he is.
Right.
Doesn't know anything about him. But God just supernaturally works that out, says, this is the woman. Now, she's never met Abram. She's never, or Abraham, she certainly has not met Isaac, but she knows enough to know, hey, this is God's will. I'm going to go. And she goes back with Abraham's servant, and this becomes Isaac's bride.
That's right.
And this is where you're going to pick up next week.
Next week.
So you have a couple questions for me to end things
sure
up.
do. Let's do. So through all of this, a big important part of what we're seeing in Genesis is the establishment and we're following the track and the story of the covenants. The new covenant.
Okay.
Where do you see that in here?
So the new covenant, I think the new covenant is the point. So we see that there's a covenant with Abraham that he's going to, that's on God. God's going to do it. Abraham, his only part is faith, the response of faith. That's the only thing Abram can do about it. And I think seeing Abraham understand that takes him 110 years to understand that. I think that's the new covenant. I think that's the whole point of the story. The new covenant is the point of the story. That God's writing faith. He's writing a relationship. He's writing, hey, you can trust me. He's writing that on Abraham's heart his entire life. And I think that's the story. That's the whole point of the Abrahamic covenant. It wasn't just to create a people. It was so that through this people, all the nations of the world can be blessed. Through this people, we find out later, Jesus the Messiah will come. Not just to be the Savior of the Jews, but the Savior thank God, for me and you too. Because I don't think you're Jewish. I know I'm not Jewish. But Jesus came to save me also.
Yes.
So I have this eternal debt to God. But man, I'm thankful that he chose to work through Abraham, because through Abraham, indeed, all the nations of the world, including my nation, my family, is blessed through Abraham and his family.
And the Word of God draws us closer and closer to Christ, and it draws us more and more in love with Him. How would you say that this passage here draws you to love Christ more?
It spurs me to want to respond by faith. I'm one who, in my sermon Sunday, I talked about Pilgrim's Progress and how the Christian life is, for so many of us, envisioned as a journey. We're going from one place to another place that we don't know where it is, but God's going to show it to us. Physically, you see that in the life of Abraham. He's wandering all over the place. He never really he has homes all over the place because they're just tents. The only real home he has is when he dies. He gets to go be buried in a cave, but yet his eyes are always looking forward. And that's the essence that when you read Bunyan, when you read the scriptures, we are on a journey. And we're on the journey of faith looking forward to a place we've not been yet, but it's a place God's told us about. God gives us glimpses of it. And by faith, we know we can trust Him to get us there. And ultimately, it's every time I read the story of Abraham, I'm challenged in my faith. Like, do I really trust God with everything I have? Can I really, God's blessed us materially greatly.
Yes.
But could I really trust God with everything that I have? Would I be willing to do it? Well, God proved Himself worthy to be trusted by Abraham, even with his son. How can you give up more than that in this life? Abraham did.
Yes.
And God proved worthy of it. So that's the challenge that makes me want to love Christ more.
Absolutely. Wow. Well, thank you for being with us. I sure enjoyed this, Jonathan. Thank you, and I hope you did too. I hope you'll join us next week. We're going to pick up at chapter 25. We're going to take a look at the life of Isaac, that son that Abraham took to sacrifice. And we're going to take a look at how the continuation of the story of Israel continues on from Isaac on. We hope to see you then. Have a good night.